special meeting of the Ames City Council for December 21st, 2021 to order. And this is a workshop primarily, but we had two items that precede that. The first is consent and council. I was just notified a few minutes ago that staff would like to have this pulled. There's a couple of things that came up that still need to be revised. We want to get done right. So we're going to go ahead and forego that. Move on to item number 2, ordinances, adopting a map, establishing new wards and precincts. Mark.
Okay. Good evening and happy winter solstice. A week ago, you decided to go with the map that the county auditor's office had drawn up, and this is that map turned into words, into an ordinance. And you know, we had a final version about 5 o'clock today that went out to you, and I also sent you a track changes version so you could just see some of the back and forths that happened, and so you would know that there weren't any major changes to it, just some really lots of little cleanups that happened. So anyway, that's it. This is the ordinance to establish new wards and precincts for the next 10 years.
Thank you. Any questions for Mark? All right. I would open up public comment. Is there anyone who wants to address council on this item on adopting a map, establishing new wards and precincts? Seeing none, we'll close public input. Entertain motion on first passage of ordinance.
Second.
All right, moving to second. Roll call, please.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Jump. Aye. Corey.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Dee Hanson. Aye.
Thank you. And given the fact that we have this very short timeline for this to get adopted, staff has requested that we have second and third readings this evening and adopting it. So would entertain a motion on suspending the rules and considering second and third readings tonight.
Move we suspend the rules. Second.
Thank you. Roll call.
Martin.
Aye.
Jump. Aye. Corey.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Dee Hanson. Aye. Fetcher.
Aye.
Very good. Thank you. Entertain a motion on second passage of the ordinance.
Move on second. Second.
Roll call.
Jump. Aye. Corey.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Dee Hanson. Aye. Fetcher.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
And entertain a motion on the third passage and adoption of the ordinance.
Move on third.
Second.
Roll call.
Corey.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Dee Hanson. Aye. Fetcher.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Jump. Aye.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to have a comment on the memorandum of agreement between the city and Story County regarding federal census block information?
Yes, this is really just a little cleanup agreement. The census, the data says this is everything that's in the city limits, and they didn't include a few things that actually are in the city limits. So by agreement, we're putting those into wards and precincts with the county. Agreement with the county, putting them into wards and precincts, and then also there are some sort of stranded census blocks, as I understand it, that where there are some townships where a legislative district goes through, and so they can't be in the precinct for voting for that legislative district because they're not in it. So they have to attach them to a precinct in Ames. This does not mean that they will be able to vote in Ames city elections. These people live outside, and there's only a few people really when you look at all of it, but they live outside the city limits. They will not be able to vote in city elections. They will simply be assigned to an Ames precinct for voting purposes. They will get a separate ballot that's a township ballot. So anyway, this is really just a standard cleanup thing. It's done every 10 years when these ordinances are passed, just because there are some things that just don't even, fit well. So.
Okay. Any questions for Mark? Entertain a motion on resolution approving memorandum of agreement.
Second.
All right. Thank you. Roll call.
Martin.
Aye.
Dee Hanson. Aye. Fetcher.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Jump. Aye. Corey.
Aye.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you to staff for all your work. I'm sure all of council read through all 15 pages of all the description and how all they.
I memorized it.
Well, you're a better person than I am, that's for sure. So, but yeah, it's a lot of detail work, and just want to recognize all the people that put a lot of effort into that, and all the proofing and working through the weekend to get it done. Thank you. All right, moving on to workshop on climate action plan. I'll turn it over to Deb, Mary, and Susan.
All right. Good evening, Mayor and Council, and welcome to the third Climate Action Planning Steering Committee meeting. And tonight's focus will be on target setting. And before we jump into that, I would like to recognize the project team. It is looking a little bit different these days with the departure of Kaylee Barrios Lane. So Kaylee has moved on to some other opportunities. And so Mary, Susan, and I will continue leading the charge and providing the information that you're needing and working with SSG. I would also like to recognize any of the Supplemental Input Committee members who have joined us in the audience, if they wouldn't mind raising their hands. Great. Thank you. And thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Naomi to kick off SSG.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And nice to see everyone again. I'm really happy to be here for this second workshop with the Council Steering Committee. So as was mentioned by Deb, this is our second meeting and it's sort of part two. We want to take a look at target setting tonight. So if we could go to the next slide. So specifically, the meeting objectives for this workshop are information sharing at first to inform steering committee members about target setting. So taking a deeper dive on what it means and how it connects to low carbon action planning. There's a couple of different ways to look at target setting. So we're going to take some time to take a closer look at that. We're going to review the target options that were developed by SSG. And we're also going to take a look at the engagement output so far. So the conversation that we've been having with the public and with the SIC members as well about target setting. So we'll sort of summarize the feedback to date. And then we want to involve. So going back to that IAP2 level, what we mean by involve, and I think I gave the dinner analogy last time. So at the involve level, what we do is we ask about concerns or aspirations and take a look at options, essentially sort of that are informed by those concerns and aspirations. So we'd like to learn essentially what they are from the steering committee about target setting and your target setting preferences. Let's go to the next slide. So an overview of the agenda. So we're going to go through the introduction, a process review, and we're going to pause for some questions and answers at that point. Then we're going to do the target review, and we'll pause at that point too as well for more questions and answers. Then we'll do the engagement update that I mentioned, and we'll pause again for questions and answers. We're going to then review SSG's recommended approach at this particular time for the steering committee and have an open discussion on target setting and then review next steps. So really what you can see is this workshop is really conversational based. We do want to share information, but we don't want to be doing most of the talking. We really do want to hear from you and what you think so that we can have as an informed and as comfortable approach moving forward in the climate action planning process as possible. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so let's take a look at the process review to date so far. Next slide. So you probably remember this diagram from the last time that we met. And so really what you can see is there's multiple steps in the climate action planning process. We begin with that data collection and pre-engagement period where we asked members of the public how they would like to be engaged. And we started collecting data from the different departments and working with the city as well. Then we moved on to creating the base year in the BAU model. BAU stands for business as usual. So taking a look at what would happen to emissions if we moved forward with the plans currently in place and took no intervening action like a climate action plan would provide. And taking a look at and sort of assessing where the energy essentially is being used and comes from in the community itself. So that really informs what the big picture is, or the size of the challenge is one way that we like to talk about it. And right now we're in the third stage where we're taking a closer look now at target setting and its implications and starting the process of low carbon action development. And as you can see in each of these sort of stops in the process, and we're still at the front end of the process, moving into the middle part of the process itself, there's arrows that I'm not sure if it's super visible, but there's circular arrows basically around each stage. And what that signifies is iteration. There's a dance between the technical process and the engagement process in a climate action plan. And we want to make sure that those two streams are essentially informing each other. And so it's common to sort of have these discussion points, learn from each other, and have what we learn in engagement inform what's happening in the technical side, and then have what's happening in the technical side inform the engagement discussion as we move forward. So it's a pretty dynamic process. This slide has a lot of information, of course, on it. So let's go to a more simplified version and drill down into the stage that we're currently in. So let's go to the next slide, please, Brittany. So analyzing the low carbon pathway for Ames is at a higher level, a 5-step process. So if we're taking one of those circles and sort of drilling down a little bit into it, this is what it looks like. The first step, really, we ask ourselves, where are the major sources of emissions and where are those opportunities essentially for us to create change? And by us, I mean the community itself. The second stage is we ask ourselves, how do we decrease emissions in that sector, or in each of the sectors sort of themselves? The third step is, how do we fit those actions together in the right order for Ames? We've mentioned before, when a low carbon action plan is put together, the low carbon action suite that comes is an entire package. Essentially, to reach the low carbon target that is set, you have to do each of the actions. It's not about picking and choosing A or B, it's about taking that package together. So we make sure that in the planning process, we get that package right for your particular community. The fourth step is, what are the capital expenditures and operational expenditures and or savings that come from that rate mix? And step 5 is, what partners or which partners in the whole process will implement each of the actions. Climate action planning is also a bit of a jurisdictional puzzle. There's multiple opportunities for different actors to each take a piece of implementation to make sure that the community as a whole is successful in achieving its target. It's a bit of a logarithmic scale though too. It's a lot of work to go from each of these steps, from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc. And we're entering stage 2 at this point. And as my colleague Yul will point out though too, a lot of work has gone into formulating stage 1 and getting us into stage 2 as well. Is there anything you wanted to add to that at this point, Yul?
No, I guess the only other piece that comes into play on the actions side is also looking at co-benefits and equity considerations.
That's a great point. We'll be talking a lot about that as well. All right, let's go into the next slide. So we are going to explore what a target is and what a target is not, and how it fits into this entire process. But first, we want to know, what questions do you have for us so far? So it's our first question and answer period.
Any questions? There appears to be no questions, so you may proceed.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, let's carry on. Okay, and I'm going to hand it over to Yul for the target setting review.
Yeah, so if you go to the next slide. So I think if you look at the landscape of municipalities who set GHG targets, there's many different reasons why municipalities set targets, and also the seriousness with which they set that target also varies across the landscape. And we've certainly encountered a lot of different types of targets in different contexts. So what we try and support is the notion of a target as a North Star. It's very bright, it's very easy to see, and it's very clear what it means. And it's also very directional. So it's what really a lot of decisions can be oriented around that target. And so that's kind of a metaphor for what I think is a really useful concept as a target. If you go to the next slide, a target really does not guarantee success. And we've seen that in the climate change planning world across the board. So many countries in particular and states have set targets and then failed to achieve them. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. Partly climate is just a really tricky thing to address. And because it's so deeply, because the energy system is so deeply entrenched, it's very difficult to transform. Interestingly, the US had set a target previously and actually achieved it under the Kyoto Protocol. The US has since set very ambitious targets, which are going to be difficult to achieve, including 50 to 52% reduction by 2030 as a country. If you go to the next slide, please. So what enables a target? I think a key piece is a common understanding of what the target is and a pathway to get there.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of
Another
distracted.
element is
Yeah.
a way to align
Yul, can we,
decision-making with that
can we
pathway.
stop?
When a decision is made, how does that actually either inhibit or enable the ability of the community to achieve the target?
Yul, this
And
is,
then
Yul,
is a key piece, which is the allocation of resources, and then also the ability to adapt going forward as situation changes.
We're getting a lot of background noise. We're getting some music and some, does anybody know what?
Sorry, one sec. I think that's on my end.
Okay.
Kind of less time.
Yeah, it's actually a pump organ of all things.
I was going to suggest a pump organ.
I think
It's a rare occurrence.
it'd be helpful for you to start. Could you start over again on what enables a target? And I think actually we kind of got distracted when you were halfway through your example explanation.
Okay. Well, I think just the point of this slide is that a target tends to be quite far out, and it's difficult to align the operations or the decision-making of a municipality with a target, say in 2030 or 2050. Like, how does a particular investment or policy either enable or inhibit the ability to achieve that target? And I think that's been one of the big challenges for municipalities in achieving their GHG targets, is actually aligning their operational decisions. And so that's a key piece that we'll be looking at in the implementation part of this project, is how do you actually make sure there's alignment with what are long-term and quite what appear to be nebulous targets. So I think the other dimension is that the strategies to achieve that target are going to evolve as technology evolves, as behavior evolves, and so on. And so being very adaptive is another key element. So if we go to slide 13, I think, Naomi, you're going to talk a little bit about the two examples.
Yeah, that's right. We just wanted to pause though to see if there are any questions at this stage as well.
I think we're getting feedback from your office also. I don't know if you got a party going on or.
It's a co-working space and someone else happens to be presenting in this room right now too. So I'll just mute myself when I'm not speaking to lower that interference.
No questions.
Do we have any questions about the target, the role of a target?
So maybe this would be a good time to help us think through the degree to which this target is binding. And so maybe I could phrase it this way. If I want to run a race in the spring, I could be very aspirational about that and say, I would like to run this race at a certain time, but if I do it, I don't, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to require any changes. It's not going to require any commitments on my part. A committed target would be one where I'd say, I am very serious about this. I'm going to have to cut some weight. I'm going to have to maybe hire a coach. I'm going to have to forego certain things to be able to achieve that goal. And so what I'm struggling with through this material is our task tonight as a council to find an aspirational goal that really doesn't bind us to anything, and it really doesn't matter if we hit it or not? Or is our goal to find a target that we can commit to that will in fact be create a standard by which we make decisions? We're about to begin our budget process in January, and depending on how aggressive we make these goals, it will have significant benefits on programs that will inevitably have to be cut and taxes that have to be raised if we're committed. And so I think the people who are very interested in the climate action plan process, my sense is they're not interested in window treatment or some symbolic gesture. They want to see us accomplish something. And so that's what I need your help with tonight is, are we thinking about more of an aspirational goal? Because we can commit to going carbon neutral by next year if it doesn't really matter. But conversely, if we're going to have a committed goal, then we're going to have a very hard conversation about the viability of that target. Which are we working on?
Sorry. So I think those are really good points. And to think about what a target does do for you, I think a target is a signal. So it signals where in the sort of climate ambition chunk of the world Ames lands. And you see some municipalities setting very ambitious signals. And that has implications in terms of how people look at the community and how, for example, companies invest in the community. And there's certainly a lot of companies that are investing based on climate plans now. So that part is an important consideration. From our perspective, it also helps us in terms of setting evaluating the pathway that we're going to look at to try and get to that target. So it helps guide the level of ambition that we should embed in the actions that we're modeling. And the modeling process itself really limits our ability to, for example, achieve net zero by next year. We would have to really pull off some magic to do that because it's constrained by the physical system that is Ames. And that means the cars that move around Ames and the households that are in Ames and the businesses that are located there. We have to come up with a viable pathway to decarbonize all of that system. And so the modeling really acts as a constraint against the target. And we may not achieve the target in the modeling, and there may be a gap between the pathway that we model and the target, and we just don't know how to fill that gap at this point, and we have to wait or hope that something in the future will change to be able to get there. And certainly a lot of municipalities have a gap between their target and the pathway that they model because it's not exactly clear what can be done to fill that gap right now. So there's, I think those are two key pieces in thinking about a target. It's a signal, and it's also something that really helps determine the pathway that we're going to try and evaluate to get there.
So I'm going to interpret that, and thank you for that. I'm going to interpret that as being more of an aspirational goal, that we're not going to make hard decisions. If we're going to make the committed approach, we're going to have to make some really hard decisions to get there. And it's going to affect taxes, it's going to affect programming, really everything we do. If we're going to do this just as aspirational, then I think that takes a little bit of pressure. It takes a lot of pressure off us tonight, doesn't it? I mean, we really don't have to be all that serious about it. Just like the race that I run, I can set that goal, and if I make it, there's really no consequences. My fear is that there will be people who are very disappointed that we don't take an approach that the target that we hit or we're agreeing to is a committed goal that will become the defining mission of our city council in all that we do. I'm afraid there'll be some very disappointed people. But I'm interested to hear what the council thinks. I mean, philosophically, we're using terms like star and signal. Is that what we want to do?
I think the second part of what he said is also what the target is. And so whatever target we set tonight is how they build then their model for us to achieve it, right? So then they lay out a better idea of all the costs and all you'll have to change these things about the way your infrastructure is now, yada, yada. But that comes later in the climate action planning process. Like that's the next step then, is for the consultants to take the goal we set and to come up with that roadmap for us. And undoubtedly, there'll be uncomfortable things in that roadmap in terms of changes and costs, perhaps, although I think there's potential for cost savings too, but that's a different line of thought. But that's what the consultant does with the target we set. And then the climate action plan comes out at the end of the process with more of what you're looking for in it, but we have to set that target for them to get there.
So this goes back to our prior workshop. It just feels a bit awkward to say, I want this, but I have no idea what it's committing the city to and what possible cost it would have.
My feeling on this is that it simply does not commit the city. That's how I'm looking at it. That this is, I mean, and this came up actually in our first discussion of this topic. Why is it that target setting is happening so early in the process? Isn't that supposed to be the end of the process? And the answer is no. The target setting it really is how we orient ourselves. It's how we direct our team to proceed with the work, but commitments aren't going to happen tonight. We're not voting on anything concrete. We're not changing any resolutions or authorizing any expenditures. That's all going to be up to the next council. And these are going to be super easy decisions for you all. But that's how I see this. That this is a way for us to really say, you know, in an ideal world, how do we want to orient ourselves? And what menu of options do we want to be able to consider when it comes back to council? Personally, I hope that council gets the largest set of options available. And if it turns out that some of them just can't be swallowed at the time, then okay. That's how I'm looking at it.
Absolutely. I will add a couple things to what you all said. First, you're correct. It's more of a directive for how we carry this project forward from here. And there will be more engagement opportunities. So if you say tonight, you know, we want, you know, net zero by 2030, we'll say, okay, we'll go back and see what we can model. And we would come back to you with a model and say, you know what, there's a gap, or here's what it's going to take. And you absolutely have, still have the ability at that point to say, okay, let's rethink a little bit of this. This probably isn't going to work for our community. So there's still those engagement opportunities. This is our first look at, you know, where does Ames want to be, what feels right at this moment, and then let's continue to build it. We've also given you the other option to say, you know what, we're not ready to have that conversation. Just start building some things that you think make sense for us based on what you've learned about our local context today and the best practices. And we can take that directive as well. And then at the end, we can come back to you and say, here's where, you know, you can have some input on this process as well, what it looks like. We can continue to adjust. And at the end of the process, we can say, here's where these actions got you to. So we can do it either way. So it is more of a directive for the work at this point. As far as it being aspirational, you know, it is, we're looking at 2050. So absolutely, you know, it is somewhat aspirational, but we also need to, we've also provided some interim targets. So the pathway to 2050 is really important. And so we do look at where does Ames want to be in 2030? And we are able to provide some, you know, some more detailed analysis around what it would take to decrease to a certain point by 2030. So a few years ago, people were only talking about 2050 targets, and those were very aspirational, right? That's a long way out. But now we talk about what's the interim, where do you want to be in 2030? It's still not binding, but it does give us, we're more able to provide you with some information around what you would need to do to be able to reach a 2030 target.
So can you impact what I heard you say was like just if you for example, if the council said they wanted to be net zero by 2030, you came back and said, okay, it's going to cost you X number of dollars, you got to do all of this. Council says, oops, no, there's no way we can do that. When we first heard your presentation, it's my understanding, once a target was set, we're stuck with that, and that your fees only included coming up with plans for achieving one target. Am I hearing you say that if that becomes non-achievable, or we just, council didn't realize that was not absolutely, you know, able to be accomplished, that you will go back and do additional work, and you go back and forth, you come up with a plan that everyone feels comfortable with, even though that target may move from 2030 to 2040 to 2050, and you have a different percentage you're trying to hit by 2030 and 2040. Can you help us understand that?
Right, absolutely. So there is some iteration to it. So obviously there's not, we don't have the ability on the timeline and scope to do unlimited iteration. But what we would do is we would take the direction from this evening, come up with some low carbon assumptions, we call them. So the actions that, you know, we will test into a model. We get your feedback on that. We do feedback with the Supplemental Input Committee. We run that. And then if you do choose a target, we'll say, okay, this close, or this is what it looks like. This is how ambitious you need to be in order to reach that. And we can have a conversation about that before we finalize those actions into the model and pathway.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, no more questions. Let's keep moving.
It's great. And these questions are wonderful because they set us up really well for this particular example that I think is also going to help with the conversation. So let's take a look. So what you see in front of you are two what are called wedge diagrams, and a wedge diagram will be created for Ames eventually as well. These are an example, though. It's two examples. One is of a community that had a target set to begin with, and the other one is of a target, there was no target set, and it's sort of what we call an evidence-based pathway. And what we mean by that is that we build it from the ground up for them as well. But what you'll notice is in both of the graphs, the area in gray is the remaining carbon essentially that's emitted. And on the right, which is the 2050 year, you'll see that it's very little in terms of grays. So all of the sort of colored wedges above that are all of the different actions that those communities need to take to achieve that target. So when we talk about actions coming together as a package, this is really kind of what we mean. In the top example, you'll see that they get to a steeper curve to 2030 before the community on the bottom, essentially does. And that also reflects the real world constraints that Yul was talking about. There's a certain amount of latency in the system, right? How many, fossil fuel based heating systems have people installed in their homes that would eventually need to be switched over? How long does it take the conversion to electric vehicles, essentially take place, whether that be personal vehicles or also in the transit system or the fleet systems of the municipality, sort of as well, for example. So we wanted to show you is that really too, when we say a target, we're, SSG creates low carbon climate action plans. So we don't come back with a plan that'll say, here's how you get to a 10% reduction in 2030 or 2050. We're really sort of the low target. There's a small sort of window between whether or not you're going to go science-based essentially, or another sort of pathway, in this case, evidence-based. So that's really what we're talking about, and the difference between those, how fast and how much basically do you want to go to get there? And that's where the working back and forth that Brittany was talking about with your particular community and its desires and ambitions and own constraints, where that sort of factors in as well. So you can see, basically we wanted to show you target setting tonight or not doesn't constrain us from being successful in putting together a plan that will work for Ames to get to a low carbon future. Let's go deeper into this example. And let's go to the next, to this sample community. So this is a community I just took recently through this sort of, so they're further along in the timeline essentially, and we've gone to what happened, we've gone to the low carbon assumptions. So in the top left, you'll see a graph, which is their BAU, their business as usual emissions for the community. And then we start with some low carbon assumptions that we can already work with. And so the graph underneath it, you'll see it's quite a steep curve, or it might even be fun to ski if you're into that sort of thing, is where we get just with the assumptions before the community has had a chance to give input on it. And so then we take that out for engagement and we show them, that's what you see in the table to the right, is the action areas that we're looking at. So in this particular case, we're looking at the building sector, and we break that into the buildings, new buildings and their energy performance, existing buildings and their energy performance, the end use of energy in buildings, and then what the projected climate impacts are. And then they have an opportunity to sort of comment on those assumptions and help us customize them essentially for their community, or talk to us about ones that might be missing. So we get to have a deep conversation about what the low carbon pathway looks like. Let's go to the next slide. And so Yul, I think you wanted to sort of start off with this one, but we'll talk about how does this example differ from a preset target example.
Yeah, I mean, the example doesn't vary a lot, as you can see, and I think we will iterate as we evolve on the target setting process, or on the modeling of low carbon actions over the course of the process. So I think really just to emphasize that there still is a lot of flexibility in the system, and that what we model really will represent a pathway for Ames, and that we are doing it on an annual time step, so you'll be able to see how that system transforms over time. So I think that's really all we need to say on that example.
Great. And so, yeah, what questions now would you have at this stage of the presentation?
Actually, there's one other thing I was thinking of just while we were talking, Naomi, to add, which was we did just model two pathways for a major city in Canada, 2.8 million population. And one was net zero by 2040 and one was net zero by 2050. And interestingly, the net zero by 2040 saved or resulted in lower costs than the net zero by 2050. And that's really a function of the electricity and gas prices and so forth in that particular context, which would vary by Ames, but it was not what we expected. So it's really interesting to see how the dynamics of renewable energy and EVs and energy costs are resulting in more savings for more ambitious action. And that was really transformative for that community.
That's great. Thanks for that, Yul. So yeah, we've got to pause now for some more questions before we go on to the survey results.
I do have a question. So you've mentioned that you'll be developing a wedge diagram for Ames. And so to go back to this issue of what if we're presented with all of these results and it turns out that there's not the appetite to take them all on that we originally thought. So it stands to reason that at least some of those things that are represented in the wedge diagram would be more or less independently controllable. It's going to require passing an ordinance or providing some funding for some sort of conversion. And so council could elect to simply postpone one or two of those. Isn't it true then that you may be able to even estimate what the impact that would have on the timeline? But I understand some other things might be more dependent and mixed up with other systems and hard to separate out and decide on individually. But doesn't that make sense that the council should be able to be a little selective in the future in a way that's not going to be totally driving in the dark?
Yeah. And I think that happens in every single municipality. I mean, there's no way you can implement all of these things at once, and there'll be energy or enthusiasm for some right away, and maybe some will take a bit longer, and setting up programs can take a while. So I think that always happens.
But also your model, I mean, you would be able to say, okay, we're just not doing this aspect of it, and then that would affect the wedge diagram. We'd have a prediction as to what that would mean, right?
Yeah, we were able to adjust those very easily.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? You say in your houses, if you can go back one slide. Yep, I'm sorry. No, go forward now. You had one. Can you help us understand how you went through this process with appears to be Toronto? It says Toronto Green Standard. Is that the community you're talking about?
If you go back where the Toronto Green Standard was in the low carbon assumption, that was the assumption that we used for this particular community.
Okay.
In order to set up the modeling for sort of setting the targets to show where they'd have to be in certain years. So we used that as a piece of evidence from another community that was appropriate for that community to be the low carbon assumption as a starting point.
So could you explain, you talk about on your next slide says, we would work to the target if one was set, provide recommendations and advice if the target did not seem feasible or desired in the community. Can you talk about how the community responded to the proposed retrofits and all the investment necessary that is talked about on your previous slide?
Yeah, definitely. So we ran that workshop, of course, with the community. So we had a community steering committee, and we have, and then we have a staff, sort of advisory committee on the inside as well. And then council itself, we're going to run that workshop essentially with them too. And so some are surprised, some are very well versed and understand that this is what's, sort of coming and as expected. And they were really interested, the staff were interested in taking a look at other programs that have been set up by other communities to how they have actually started to work towards that goal. And so that's something that we work with them to provide those examples and sort of work through what the steps might look like in order to achieve those targets. Sort of getting them out of the gate, you know what I mean, essentially, or talking about the race analogy again, what actually gets you off of the couch, sort of thing too. And so it sort of starts that conversation. The community in this particular case wanted an aggressive target and wants like a science-based aligned target. And many of the conversations in the community there have been about what the implications of that would be versus the evidence-based target. So that's where that conversation currently sits in that community. So that example is not Toronto, I should say. But that's what this iterative process of climate action planning lends itself to, is that we're not just talking about a target eventually, like even within a sector that's isolated now from understanding what it would take potentially to get there. This gives them, when we're at this stage in the process, a clearer sense of what the challenges and opportunities would be in order to make those targets a reality. And sort of that part of the engagement process gets really rich in terms of the feedback and the concerns and the aspirations that we start to hear that then allow us to adjust the pathway accordingly, as Joel was talking about. But please let me know if that answered your question or if you wanted more detail.
Yeah, I think so. Can you share what the overall cost for all those implementations are and how it's going to be paid for?
In that particular case, we're in that process, so I can't share those the cost at the moment because that's what's being figured out. Once we've had that sort of conversation to say, yes, they're good with these assumptions, these are reasonable, sort of the community, we'd like to know what this costs, we then move into that stage. Part of the low carbon modeling assumptions also need to be run in order to answer some of the financial questions as well, so they're linked together that way. I don't know, Yul, though, do you have a particular plan that we could share that's that you'd recommend, like that would be relatable to Ames, the most relatable to Ames with the costs associated?
I think Halton Hills would be very similar. I could pull up the costs for that. I mean, if you think about, for example, deep retrofit, you're talking, which includes solar PV on a home, for example, you're talking 60 to 100, well, maybe 50 to $80,000 investment per house, and you can amortize that over some period, and typically it'll pay back within 18 or less years in some case, depending on the energy structure or any energy price structure and location. So all of those kind of details will get calculated in the course of this project.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
But I can certainly point you towards a financial analysis for another community that would give you a sense.
I'm sorry, where's Holly Hills?
It's north of Toronto. It's about, it's around 60,000 people. But they actually had a target of net zero by 2030, and they did not achieve that target. So their pathway doesn't achieve that target. So it's an interesting example in that sense.
But they set out, so at this stage in the process, they wanted to go very aggressive. They were clear that they wanted to try for net zero for 2030. So that really shaped, the process going forward and let us get to those types of specifics so they could eventually see they're going to get close, but not quite as, like there's a bit of a gap, as we mentioned before, but they've still adopted that as their target. And that is what they're using to guide them as they make decisions now when they're in the implementation phase of the project. And they just adopted it, what, a month and a half ago, roughly?
Yeah.
So Yul, are those financial documents that are public records that you can share with us?
Yeah, I can point you to all of the reports. And it's an interesting example for you as well, because they have a retrofit program that they've already launched. They have a green standard, which is for new construction, that they've launched. So there's lots of, they've kind of gone down some of the pathways that might be informative for you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one thing about the table on creating a pathway? I just want to make sure I'm interpreting this accurately. In the existing buildings energy performance category, we've got pre-1980 buildings, 65% retrofit by 2030, 85 by 2040, and then ultimately 95. Are those numbers higher at the outset because those buildings are going to need more retrofitting than the post-1980 buildings, which are 40% retrofit and then 65% retrofit? Am I accurate in characterizing it that way? That the older buildings are going to need the retrofitting more, and therefore they're going to take the brunt of the front end of the retrofit?
Yeah, that's right. And there's more efficiencies and more cost savings from that chunk of the building stock. So in this case, we were targeting that chunk of building stock because that was where we could get the biggest bang for the buck to start the whole effort underway. And also that was also where the lower income chunk of the population was living. So it gave an equity benefit right away as well.
And these numbers are specific to this particular community. So these assumptions are, again, like when we talked about making this specific, so you're not going to see that's not a blanket set of numbers that we use for every community that we go into.
Right. I'm actually curious whether this particular community had more of those pre-1980 buildings than post-1980 buildings, because obviously with younger communities, you're going to have newer building stock. And older communities are going to have the older building stock, presumably, unless they've done a clear cutting of their older houses, which certainly happens. And so I guess I'm looking at this thinking, wow, so those older communities are going to be hit harder at the front end of a process because that's where the bang for the buck is. And yet that's also kind of throwing up a little bit more of an insurmountable challenge for those communities.
I would flip that around and say, I mean, one of the most cost-effective communities that we worked with was a community with a very old building stock. And because of that, there's so much efficiency gains that can be achieved and also so many savings that can be achieved. And so it's actually, I think having an older building stock in a way is a real opportunity, because you can actually you can make a really big difference quite easily relative to a newer building stock. For example, a really new community that has all new natural gas distribution and natural gas furnaces, that's a hard community to retrofit because those are still very valuable assets and they're difficult to replace. Whereas with older building stock, you really have a lot of opportunity to make things better quickly.
I guess I can see that on the back end, but it seems very, very expensive on the front end, especially if you're talking about LMI communities. And, you know, we know here in Ames that the people who want to live in most of our older neighborhoods are looking for the more affordable housing. And so they're theoretically the people perhaps who are least likely to be able to afford that sort of retrofit. And I'm not arguing against it, because I think you make a compelling argument that at the back end of this, you've got so many more of the savings in energy, et cetera. But I just want to make sure that I'm conceptualizing this accurately.
Right, which is a twofold challenge. One is a financial challenge, like where do you actually get the capital to pay for those retrofits, and who pays that capital? So that's one part of the challenge in the low income context. And then the second part is, how do you actually find the capacity to do those retrofits so that they're done well and that they're reliable? Because that's also another major challenge in delivering those kind of retrofits. And those are exactly the type of problems that we would dive into in the implementation phase.
And then maybe I'd argue a third challenge is, you know, a transition or retrofit series isn't done. The cost of energy skyrockets, and you're still now left with an affordability issue with respect to energy poverty, you know, in the housing stock as well. So that it's pretty dynamic system, I would say. And these types of questions are excellent because they're often what sort of forefront how you would create an incentivization program, one that sort of targets low-income individuals and retrofits depending on where it is that they live, or handling things too, like what's known as the split incentive problem, where what do you do with rental stock, where the benefit would accrue essentially to the person renting, you know, in terms of lower energy costs, but not the capital cost, of course, would be incurred by the landlord. And so we've certainly seen programs too that come into play to handle this particular problem, that allow the incentivization to be there for the capital cost in retrofit to be done, and the savings are then passed on to the renter, you know, as well. So yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle, and it's how those incentives sort of roll out is unique in each community and also dependent on what's available. But being ready for it is one of the key factors to success, I would say.
Thank you. Any other questions on this topic? Otherwise, we'll keep on moving on. I think you're good to go. Keep on moving. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. So the quick engagement update from me, and then Brittany's going to dive into survey results to hear what we've heard. So just as a quick reminder, we've set the project engagement level of influence over the final action plan to be at the involved level. So again, if I were inviting you over to dinner at the involved level in advance, I would say, hey, we're going to see you on Tuesday night. Can you tell me about any allergies that you have, any food preferences, any time that you had dinner that was a total disaster? I would take that information in. I would come back to you with a series of options based on the feedback that you gave me. So that's the type of conversation essentially that we're having with stakeholders throughout this process and each of the engagement techniques like tonight that we're implementing throughout the plan. Let's go to the next one. And so essentially, since November, we've done a community survey. We're going to take a look at the results of that. And we've had the supplemental input committee outreach and work. We've had 2 sort of meetings with them. And they've also been busy doing outreach to their communities as well to gather feedback into the process, some of which you'll hear tonight as well. So it's really been wonderful to work with them. And I'm going to hand it over to Brittany to take the presentation forward from here.
All right, thank you, Naomi. So I'm going to get into the survey results first. So as you know, you received a summary of the survey results already in advance. So I will reiterate, we did analyze the results 3 times. And I do want to let you know that there wasn't a lot of difference in the ways in between the 3 sets of analysis. But we did want to run the analysis 3 times because what we found is that some people identified as not being a resident of Ames, but they did take the survey, and others, our survey tool did capture IP addresses, and we had a significant number of out-of-state IP addresses, which is okay. Those people could be residents of Ames that were taking that from elsewhere. We do know that there was a holiday during the engagement period, so we did just want to take a look, though, to understand whether the results differed at all if we looked at those 3 different kind of groups of respondents. And so I can tell you that it did not change things materially, but we did run it 3 times anyway. So I do want to highlight a couple of questions that we asked the community, the survey respondents. And so the first one was, when considering target selection, should council at a minimum commit to net zero emissions by 2050? So this is kind of what we would see as the bare minimum is the 2050 target. And then we also like to see a 2030 interim target set so that, or to understand where the city wants to be, so that we can start building a pathway around that. And so the results from the community here were around 80% said yes to that. Again, regardless of how we filtered that. Around 15 to 17% said no, that they do not agree with that minimum commitment. And then around 2% were not sure. We did ask a couple other questions, as you know, in the middle about how people would rank their priorities. So I'll just talk about those briefly as I bring up our target preference slide here. So we did get feedback. We were trying to understand, we're asking people to state their target preference, but not everybody has the same level of knowledge on what those targets mean. We did provide some information. So we did want to ask them what they prioritize. And so when we did that, people did prioritize emissions reductions over, at any cost, basically. So that was our first set of, we had people rank 1 through 6. And so what we understood is that people really do care about emissions reductions. We had another set of questions and asked people to rank, and those were around equity concern or addressing equity, economic outcomes, and city aesthetics resulting from the plan. And the top answer there was actually the resulting aesthetics of the city. People did care about that a lot. What is their city going to look like and feel like to live in after this energy transition happens? And so when we did get into the target preference question, I will just run through these again to remind you what they mean. So the number 1 choice for respondents with over 40% of respondents choosing this was the science-based fair share target. So that was the most aggressive target that we put forward. So that would be an 83% reduction in emissions by 2030 and then net zero by 2050. And so the 2030 is over the 2016 baseline. We had around 10% of people state that they would like the evidence-based target. So that's building it from the ground up, and also 10% wanting the general science base. So that's a 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. We had around 15% that wanted the federally aligned. So that's around a 50% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050. We had 3 or 4% that weren't sure. Over 10% felt that all of these were too aggressive, and about 5% that felt that none of them were aggressive enough. So we do have some outliers there. So these were interesting results for us. We have a significant proportion of the community that is interested in that most aggressive target, but then we have a pretty even split almost amongst those other 5 options that were offered, or at least 4 of them. So these were interesting results. There's certainly no consensus in the community. We're not going to please everyone regardless of the target chosen kind of at this moment. So there's some work to be done there. to understand, again, people's concerns and their aspirations. So that's something we'll keep doing throughout this process. The other thing that I would say on the survey before we move on here is there were 902 responses, which is, it's a significant amount of responses given the size of the community and the length of time that the survey was open. It's still not a statistically relevant survey, so that's not the type of surveys that we put forward. It is, interested and affected individuals, people who want to respond. That being said, the demographic data that we collected showed, we were close to representing the demographics of Ames with the respondents that we got. We weren't quite there. There was some overrepresentation of ages 35 to 64, a little bit of overrepresentation of white and Caucasian people. But overall, it was fairly in line with the community demographics. I just want to highlight here a few things that we heard. We did provide this as well, a summary of all of the open comments. So we did provide people with the space to provide any additional information that they wanted to, any further comments on target setting. And so we just want to highlight that, we really heard very diverse perspectives about this. We heard a few, I won't read through all of these for you. I'll leave them up on the screen here for a moment, but we had a range from people asking for Ames to treat this like an emergency, to people saying they had absolutely no interest in any sort of emissions reduction action being taken. We heard some concerns about the burden on low-income individuals. We heard from individuals who felt like this was an economic opportunity. So we really heard, a lot of different perspectives on this, which is, it's encouraging that we had such a diversity of opinions, and it's challenging to comb through and to understand, how council wants to move forward with all of that information that was received. So I'll just remind you that again, our commitment is to listen and to create a set of choices based on. I'll pause there if you have any questions on the survey in particular before I move on to the supplemental input committee engagement.
I might be jumping the gun on this, but given those survey results, it seems odd that your recommendation is not the science-based target.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. So there's not a caveat to that, but we'll explain our approach there, why we're recommending building it from the ground up at this point.
I have a question too, and I think you alluded to this. I think I know what's going on, but by reading the comments, it's clear that a number of people really took offense at being asked demographic information. Could you explain why you do that, and perhaps maybe arrange for future surveys to make it clear why you're doing that, so that people kind of understand that it's not nefarious?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So there's two reasons that we do this. One is to do simply what I did here, was to tell you whether or not it felt like it was representative of the community. Again, it's not a statistically significant survey, but we do like to reflect that back to councils because often we get asked that question. But more specifically, the reason that we do this is because we know from years of research that in climate action planning in particular, people that are in equity-seeking groups tend to be not included in these conversations, essentially. And so what we like to do is we like to collect demographic information so we can understand, and we can work with together with city staff, and we can kind of check through to understand if we are reaching a good cross-section of the community that's representative of the community. Are we leaving anybody else out? Are there certain groups that we're not reaching? So then we can go back and we can adjust our distribution strategies to make sure that we can find a way to hear those voices. And And if it's really not working for us in the survey, then we do need to go back, and find, a different engagement technique in the next iteration. So that's really why we do it, is to ensure that we're getting that good cross section of the community.
Great.
And to answer the other part of your question, we can of course write that into a future survey, but also it's important to note that choose not to say is also an option for all of the demographic questions.
Yeah, absolutely. People can always prefer not to disclose any of their demographic.
Of course, I think a little more explanation would be helpful. We don't want people getting mad at the beginning of a survey. Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move on then to the Supplemental Input Committee engagement piece. So we went through a process with the Supplemental Input Committee. Basically, we asked them to reach out to their sectors in advance of the last meeting that we had with them. So we did have a meeting with them to talk about target setting, to help them understand what target setting meant, much like we talked about earlier here, and to talk in a little more depth about the options that we presented to this group the last time. And so we went through a bit of a process where we created an outreach toolkit for Supplemental Input Committee members. We provided them with some strategies for reaching out to their sectors, because that's one of the key pieces of having that committee, is not just to hear the perspectives of the individuals in the room, but for them to bring back information from their broader sector. So we created a toolkit for them to help them conduct that outreach if they needed that support. We also provided them with some specific questions to ask during this phase of the process, so that we could get input specifically on the target setting process. And so we will continue with that throughout the remainder of the project, where we will provide some specific questions related to the phase of the project that we're in, so they can go back out, and we'll also provide them with some information so they feel informed. We gave them some instructions on how to report back. So we gave them a few options, to bring us information back to the meeting. We gave them an online form, or the option to also email us. And then we, in the workshop that we had with them last month, we provided the opportunity to discuss some questions in small groups, essentially about the target setting process and what they heard. What were common themes, what were outliers that they heard, what were people's concerns and aspirations again. So the questions that we did ask the SIC and ask them to outreach on this time was, what is important to consider when setting a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target for the community, and what are your desired outcomes from the CAP, and what does Ames look like when the plan is implemented? And so there were some emergent themes that came back to us when those SIC members reported back to us. One of the things that we heard is that a plan is more important than a target. We actually saw this in some of the comments in the survey as well. And so it's not a universal feeling, but there's certainly a strong theme that we heard of just get going, get to work. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, let's not spend too much time on this target process. Let's just get a plan in place and start working at it. And so people are really valuing having the actions and being ready to go with implementation. We did hear a lot about an aggressive target again. So a lot of those SIC members were looking, or their sectors were looking for a more aggressive target. Equity, so we had a long conversation, very good conversation during the Supplemental Input Committee meeting. And we heard in the feedback that people are really interested and concerned about equity. And so equity comes in a few forms, and some of the ones that really stood out to us were especially around low income, people experiencing poverty or living on a low income, and how we could adapt the process to make sure that they were included and able to take some of the same action steps that other people in the community were able to take. And education, so people brought back to us that there's still some education that needs to be done around climate change in general in the community, and then also on the plan itself. And so we will sift through that to see if there's some other outreach tactics that we can use with the SIC and then hopefully there are partners in the community that will continue to be doing some broader education on that broader climate change piece. We also received some feedback on the how. So this often happens. People jump ahead. They get excited about the pieces where they want action to be taken. So I want to just share a little bit of that. I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the low carbon action development phase and in the implementation phase, but addressing waste and recycling, home energy use, and transportation. So these are the things that are kind of at the front of people's minds when they think about reducing emissions. Again, you know, we heard, I wouldn't say we certainly heard some diverse comments, but certainly, you know, probably not as diverse as the survey, but some really good points were made. So we heard things like costs can be investments that are economic drivers. Again, there's one there about, you know, let's just make a decision now. It doesn't have to be perfect. Let's just get going. You know, that, you know, having a plan is important because it can drive the ability to attract funding for some of the actions, because it shows a commitment and it shows a desire for action. So again, a lot of really great comments that we heard. Yes, I see. All right. Any additional questions about that engagement that was done for this phase of the project?
It does not appear to be that way, so you please proceed.
Okay, great. We'll move on. So we're going to move on to our recommended approach. And so we had a question about this already, and I think that's great. This is the part where we're going to get into a discussion here. And so at this point, we are making the recommendation that that we lead a process to develop a bottom-up pathway for the city to inform a target that reflects local circumstances in Ames and the effort required to address climate change. And so I'm going to tell you why we're making this recommendation. And you can feel free to agree with our recommendation, to take our recommendation, or to go in a different direction. We have, of course, given you 4 target options. One of them being evidence-based. They're all very, I think, acceptable targets. And so we're happy with whatever you decide, and we will model and move forward with whatever you decide. Why we're making this recommendation at this point is because we did see a lot of support for the science-based target, but we're also seeing there's a lot of questions and a lot of hesitancy around making decisions before we know what the actions are. And so looking at it this way allows us to build those actions up first and then have the discussion about the target later, or to let the target emerge from that. And so absolutely, we can still build from the bottom up with the idea in mind of, let's see if we can get to that most aggressive target. Let's see how far we have to push. And if we have to, we can, you know, step back a little bit, or we could push even further if it looks like that's a very plausible pathway for us. But it does give council the flexibility to say, okay, let's take a moment here, learn a little bit more, keep that aggressive target in mind, and see if we can get to it without actually committing to that tonight. But like I said, we are open to whichever way that you want to go. We think that you know, we've got lots of community support, you know, for these different targets and essentially for moving forward. And so, like I just described, these are the 5 steps that we spoke about earlier. So we've identified the major sources of emissions and where those opportunities lie for decreasing emissions. We've done that through our baseline analysis. And now we need to get into this process that talks about how we're going to decrease emissions, how we're going to fit the actions together, what it's going to cost, and what the savings are, or what the net benefit is going to be, and which partner implements the actions. And so we can certainly build the target as we go, as we identify those different steps. So let's discuss. So I want to open this up now for your comments, for your questions, and generally for your discussion about, you know, how you're feeling around this process and the target at this point. And when we're ready, when we're at the end of that discussion, I believe Deb will provide kind of the options, kind of the official options for how we move forward here tonight.
David?
I do have a question. You said that you were seeing a lot of question and hesitancy about making a decision before we know what the actions are. My question is, from whom were you seeing those questions and hesitancy that was important? Is it that, are you hearing this from council? Are you hearing this from the Supplemental Input Committee? Are you hearing it from the survey respondents, or a combination of them? Does anything stick out?
Yeah, I think there's a combination in there of people, you know, still having questions around what the actions would look like for Ames. I think that the last time we did speak with council, there were a lot of questions, certainly, and we don't want to. And those questions are fair. They're absolutely fair, valid questions, and we don't want to push anybody into a process where they're feeling uncomfortable when we could still get to the same endpoint, but build it with you from the ground up first to ensure that council's comfortable with it, the SIC is comfortable with it, and the community is more comfortable with it. And so that's, you know, we are hearing it from all sides, I would say.
So just to be clear, it sounds like your answer was that you feel that hesitancy is kind of equally distributed among the three groups that I mentioned. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Thanks.
Mayor, are we going to be taking public input tonight?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Other comments, questions?
So I would love to, Mary, you're sort of our expert that we've been working with for a long time on this. And we're sort of at a crossroads. Do we pick out a target, a North Star, a signal, and then try to build towards that? Or do we do the evidence-based? The consultant is saying we can get to the same result, but I'd love to, I think we'd all benefit from hearing your thoughts on this. This is your area.
No pressure.
That's what we're being asked to decide, right? We can't, I don't think it's fair to ask staff they've given us the choices that we need to follow. And they're looking for direction from us on this. I don't think it's fair to put that back on Mary, I guess. And
so I'm not trying to dodge the bullet on policy. That's why we're on this side of the dais. But I think we'd be remiss to not have our consultant we've been working with for I don't know how many years, the city, not to give input on this important juncture. I mean, I don't know if it's fairness or just wisdom.
I mean, yeah, I guess I see that as a policy decision.
Well, can we frame this as a non-policy decision? That let me try another bite of the apple this way. Mary, when you think about the kinds of pieces that a city would have available to it to reach carbon neutral goals, can you walk us through what some of those might be and how we might think about building those into our planning for our next budget cycle, for example?
Well, one thing that I would say is we did bring the consultants on, having so much experience directly related to putting these plans together. So I think they offer a wealth of wisdom. And I think that, you know, something has resonated. I've heard the consultants mention this on a few different occasions. And certainly you see this in communities around the country looking at climate action planning. Is one of the first things to consider is how you can ensure the efficiency of what you are currently demanding within your community and within that infrastructure. So that then when you are making those transitions, you're doing it in, you know, the leanest, most efficient manner possible. So, I mean, I think that would be one of the biggest considerations for us to really look at how we're currently functioning and how can we make that, you know, as efficient. related to some of these other technologies, there's so much that's changing. And while I appreciate your consideration of me being an expert, I think the consultants, having done a number of these plans, really have their thumb on the pulse of that very effectively.
Okay, thanks.
Thoughts? Alan?
I mean, I'd lead right into a motion if you
Well,
let me.
no,
but-
we're not ready for that yet.
Okay, I'll wait. I'll wait till we are then,
Okay.
because I think, I mean, I'm
Okay.
it's all wrapped up in what I'd say.
So one of the things that I am wondering, and I don't know if there is an answer to this, is if we were to go with the evidence-based model, does that create the perception that we are dragging our feet on moving forward with the plan? And how much does it draw out the process? As opposed to simply adopting the science-based 83% by 2030 goal.
That's a great question. It doesn't slow down the process at all from our end. So absolutely. So the next steps here are to go through the low carbon actions to develop those and to ensure that they're tailored to Ames. And so what we will do, so the biggest difference would be if you choose a target this evening, like a defined target, I will say, then we will work on the assumptions. We will make sure that the model matches as closely as it can to that target before we bring it back to you. And we'll say, this is what that would look like. And then and then do our next round of engagement. If you're choosing the evidence base, we're going through a process where we're saying, here's what to us at this point makes sense for Ames, and then bring it back to you for engagement. And you can say, and you and others that we're engaging, other stakeholders could say, hey, we can do more here. This doesn't seem feasible. So it's a very similar process. And like I said, we could get to the same point at the end. So it does not slow our process down at all.
Could I follow up on that, please? And I completely agree that and believe that it would not affect the project team's process at all. But I think it does affect the community. It affects the messaging. It affects the sense of urgency. And I think people will understand. Based on the motions that passed tonight, they'll understand, accurately or not, they'll have a takeaway with how seriously this is being taken.
So help council understand. I mean, first of all, the energy consumption, the vehicles that were taken into consideration included every building and every vehicle that runs in the city. Is that correct?
So it includes all buildings within the city, and then we all in factories, so within the city, vehicle trips is what we look at for transportation, and then we take a portion of the trips that are originating in Ames and going elsewhere, and then a portion of the trips that are leaving from somewhere else and coming to Ames. So that's how we do the transportation calculation for emissions.
So help us understand, how do you balance the fact that we have a land grant university that we have absolutely no control over, that's run by the Board of Regents. We have an Ames Community School District that has a brand new high school being built and 5 elementary schools, and they run school buses and they have their own vehicles. We have the Department of Transportation headquarters here. We have the Animal Disease Lab, and there are probably others that I'm forgetting, all of which I think Iowa State, is in doing some climate action, planning. But help us understand, how have you worked with other communities where this exists? Because I think 45-50% of our labor force is actually employed by governmental entities. So we have a large, amount. And so if an aspirational target was set versus trying to build consensus through an evidence base, how do you work? How do you reconcile that, or is that enter into your decision or of your recommendation?
You're getting to the heart of the beast here. This is the complication of developing the action plan, climate action plan. It's a community-wide plan, right? And so no one entity can implement this plan on their own. And that's one of the things that makes it a little bit different from the other plans that a municipal government would engage in. And so it requires participation from every sector in your community. And you will not have complete control. Right? There are areas where you will have more control and more influence than others. But again, that's what sets it really apart from other processes that a council would typically engage in. And that's across the board in any community.
Yeah, I would say too, communities that tend to do this well form strong partnerships to help with the implementation, and where the partners come in too to share in the responsibility of how implementation essentially rolls out. So yeah, as Brittany said too, you won't have control over everything necessarily that needs to happen, but partnerships tends to be a good model and pathway to start that conversation and figure out who in the community is going to do what. We tend to find too, though, that there's a lot of commitment, and there's a lot of questions too that other types of partner organizations in the community are often asking, and municipality can play a key role in essentially quarterbacking that too. So it's one we can talk, of course, more about this, but just to give you a quick example, partnerships are certainly, I think, a key to success moving forward into implementation.
So there's an old adage: participation breeds ownership. And I'm just, again, trying to draw upon your expertise and what you have seen work successfully in other similar communities. It's not just for 66,000 residents. We are half students, or about half students. And we have a lot of entities that really haven't, we do have representatives on our SIC committee, but they're not necessarily decision makers. They can't commit to things. There's not really been much partnership, to my knowledge, of really engaging in this process. And I'm just trying to think in terms of buy-in and partnership and commitment. Which approach have you seen that's been the most successful in getting that to be successful in terms of implementation and moving forward as a community?
You were going to jump in? I was going to say, go ahead, and then I can follow up.
Sure. Yeah, I would say it's really different in every community. We're seeing in one community, there's a roundtable, a climate action roundtable that's been formed with all of the major employers in the community, and to coordinate opportunities and things like bulk procurement and even coordination of fleet replacement with electric vehicles. So that's one model that we've seen. Ames is really lucky with the electricity utility, and that gives you a lot of leverage that other communities don't have, and opportunities that other communities don't have. So that can be one interesting piece of the puzzle. There's another community set up, what was called the Learning Laboratory for the business sector, where the businesses would try out different low carbon actions and then share their experiences amongst each other. And that really spread quickly as people it gave people the freedom to try things they might not try. And then once they saw one business try it out, the others would try it out. So I think there's a lot of experimentation going on in terms of how you support that kind of partnership approach. But in every case, the municipality is really the foundation of the effort, because it's the stable, sort of all-encompassing or all-seeing partner. I think that's the one standard piece in every one of these efforts.
Have you worked with other university communities?
Many, yeah. So one community that has 6 universities and also a major Department of Defense base that we worked with has a coordination effort with all of those entities underway. And universities can be really powerful partners, as they are in your case. Like, I think you already have a very strong, remarkably strong relationship within the university context, which I think there's a lot of opportunity to build upon that.
Well, I would agree with you. I think we have a very strong relationship with, and we're committed to that. in all those, in that one that has the 6 universities and Department of Defense, did the city go ahead and just set a target and expect the partners to go ahead and commit to that also?
Yeah, and they actually had, so they had a, similar to the SIC, they had a committee, except it had, I don't know, 70 members on it. So it was much larger. And the city set the target and then requested that all the partners make a letter of commitment at the end of the process. Not all did, but many did. And then the city sort of helping to steward the implementation of those letters of commitment in annual progress reports. But they actually made, like the universities made public statements saying that they would align their commitments.
Other questions?
And you need a level of trust to pull that off. I feel like you guys have that level of trust in your context already.
What we don't have is that policymaker decision, board of regents, university president, school board conversations. Those haven't happened as of yet.
Right.
And so consequently, to set a target that they have no input or any kind of, I mean, is a top down, this is what we're going to do. This is our target in lieu of what you're recommending, the evidence-based approach. Would that build more ownership and participation because they're being part and parcel of that conversation, allows us to keep the process going without pushing pause? Or, I mean, it's a policy decision, it's a philosophical decision, and it's just more or less, we are committed in this community to working together, and we want to continue that. So I'm just trying to draw upon what your experience has been and what has worked well.
Yeah, it's a great question. One recent community that we worked with as well is has a large university, and one of the things that they're considering now nearing the end of their process is developing a memorandum of understanding with the university. And so they have a number of items that they want to address through that MOU. So it includes what sort of research and innovation kind of pilots that the city and the university can work on together. And then they're also one of the other items in it that's really important for both parties is being one another's support for funding applications. So there are certain funding applications that or funding programs that the university is eligible for, and certain programs that the municipality is eligible for. And so they're working together to support one another and to support one another's projects.
At what point in the process that the city was going through was that university brought into the mix and part of the conversation?
So they were a part of like a community committee, much like the Supplemental Input Committee. And then throughout the process, we did end up having some interviews with representatives, and that they continued the conversation themselves.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
And I would say, or just to add to that, just a partnership conversation, if it's of interest, can start, I think at any time that you feel appropriate, as well. I've led a plan for a city that had 5 major partners, and it was a city that was responsible for tourism. So they all have, each city has its own interesting sort of challenges, and they had to supply and pay for infrastructure for 5 times its population. So having those partners, sort of in the creation of the plan itself and then ownership of the plan certainly was quite helpful. And they did annual check-ins where we had 17 task forces, because that was right for that particular community, even though it was a population of 10,000, that all of the partners sat on, also with members of the community, to action plan each year and actually see which actions got them closer to their target, and which didn't. Because also being a sort of climate, being the sort of system that it is, we sometimes think we know how we're going to get from A to B, and in some cases we do, but other pieces of the puzzle aren't as obvious. And so having that constant finger on the pulse of engagement and action planning, sort of really helped that community learn in real time what was working and what was still challenging, and who should take on what piece of the puzzle, as well. So as you all said, and Brittany, there's multiple models too. If there was one particular way that worked, we would definitely be coming with that recommendation to you. But the positive news is that each of these communities have been quite creative in responding with their own resources and their own ambition to come up with their own creative solutions to the partnership question.
Other questions?
Some of the comments that were in our packet had to do with the availability of funding right now and getting off the mark in order to access that funding. And I know, for instance, that the infrastructure bill had something like $73 billion in it for power grids and renewable energy and research in carbon sequestration. So I guess my question is, we know that there's a perception issue here, right? If we drag our feet, drag our feet by doing the evidence-based approach, are we missing out on the opportunity to get a jump start on applying for funds, or is that still going to take long enough that we really aren't going to see any benefit in getting off the mark with a science-based decision tonight?
That's a great question. So what we've seen to date, and the landscape is always changing, I will say that, but what we've seen to date is what seems to be important for funding at this point, or what seems to be a consideration for some funding situations, is having a plan. The targets at this point, like what the target is, has not seemed to impact the ability to procure funds. Funders want to see a plan. They want to see some sort of commitment from communities. But like I said, that, you know, the landscape is always evolving. There's so much funding, and there's programs changing every day at those federal levels and at those other funder levels. But that's what the kind of history of it has been.
Okay, council, before a motion, I just want to offer just some thought, and I'm just going to go back to my profession, designing buildings, and give you an example and just some, I think it applies. When I was working with clients, one of the most difficult thing to do was to have a budget set and then all of a sudden find out that you can't get everything done for the budget which is set. And it's like taking candy away from a baby because you're cutting out this room, or you're cutting this off, you're cutting this off. And so we developed a policy that we would not give initial budgets to start with for a project, because it became a target that people were trying to, you know, work with. And then all of a sudden what happens is that they get disappointed in the end. So we would build from the ground up, start developing cost analysis through that process, and give options to our clients in order to know how to arrive at, you know, decisions, and then come to an agreed to, you know, budget. I think we're going to get to, with regards to the climate action plan, which I am fully supportive of. This council set this goal 2 years ago. We're working towards it. It's going to happen. They're both, all of them are going to hit the 2050. The question becomes is that how fast you're going to get to it. I think that the business, or the one of the graphs they're showing was, you know, very helpful. I just want to share that one of the concerns with setting an aspirational target is if you have to start cutting because all of a sudden the costs are so high or they're just untenable, are you going to start having to deal with people saying, I'm disappointed, you got to do this, you got to do this, because you're working and setting a goal that really doesn't have any specific costs or projects. I understand, we talked about this several times. I get it. I understand why they have to go through that process. I was very encouraged tonight to hear that there's a reiterative process that they're planning on going through. So that is some level of comfort. But I read through all the comments that are in the packet. And it was very interesting. I started there was 50 different comments on what are the costs. Some are saying, don't you dare raise my taxes. One person said, I paid $300 for a solar panel. That's enough. Some didn't use very good language. You probably saw that too. The bottom line is, and a number of them were very, very supportive of going forward, but they said, and I won't go through and, you know, quote them, you know, but I would just say is that it was very illuminative that we want to move this forward, but what's going to be the impact on us. But it's more than just one or two people who said, don't raise my taxes, I'm not paying anything more. So the bottom line is, I think that we're all of you are committed as council to moving forward this. I just caution that if a specific number is set, and then you find out next year with David not being here, how convenient, Mr. Martin.
I've got your checkbook, by the way.
Oh, yeah. By the way, we'll keep you appraised of how things are going too. So anyway, but the point being is that it would seem, and also absent Iowa State being at the table, really being at the table, the school board, other entities that really we need to have as partners, it would just seem to me to build that partnership and to build ownership may help us get maybe to our goals that we want to get to as quickly as possible. But I just am apprehensive that you might have saying, well, all of a sudden this goal has been set and we're expecting you to come alongside and buy into it. So anyway, I'm just we're going to work together. I'm going to support what your motion is. We're going to move forward. It's just, I'm trying to anticipate what might be some heartache, heartburn, and also disappointment. And let's just trying to set realistic expectations going forward. And I really do not agree that a evidence base is really dragging our feet. I think that's a mischaracterization. I think it's more or less we want to do it because, and I would, the staff had a very interesting, I just want to quote it real quick before I close. In their introductory first page, it says the next task for the steering committee is establishing a relevant, achievable, and cost-effective emissions reduction goal with assistance from SSG and considering the feedback from the SIC and citizens. And I think that really sums up what we're committed to doing is a relevant, achievable, and cost-effective. And it just seems to me that building piece by piece, working together, seeing how hard we can push, but not setting something and all of a sudden finding out we just can't hit that. And then all of a sudden, all of my clients having to have something taken away from them and saying, I'm really disappointed. So with that said, I'm done. Anyone else have any comments? Otherwise, I'd entertain a motion.
Yeah, I'd make one last comment and a motion if I could.
Certainly.
I certainly understand your points, Mayor, and I appreciate them. I think the evidence-based model, it looks like we could maybe get to the same place, but I think there is a lot of value in making a stance with a target to, it's motivating to people. So it's not only signaling, but it's also a rallying cry that can be motivating. And for Tim's running example, if you start to tell people you're going to run a race in the spring, behavioral science would show you much more likely to do it than if you just kept that to yourself, right? So the more you say a goal, the more you speak a goal out loud, that is motivating, right? And it's motivating for our partners. I hope that they wouldn't see that as something we're forcing upon them that is all bad. As to the cost, I'm sensitive to that too. But again, the cost of inaction is something we're not talking about much, and it's significant. People are going to have to pay a lot more in taxes to deal with drought and flooding and heat and you name it. So I understand that maybe people don't see that, but I believe it's true. And so although the consultant is recommending the evidence-based approach, this is the time for Ames to step up and declare an ambitious goal. I think it's our responsibility, both to our citizens and to the global community and to future generations. So for that reason, I would move that we adopt the science-based fair share approach, setting our target at an 83% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050.
I'll second. So I'll just add a couple of things to that. But I agree with Bronwyn's motion as well. And I think we've talked a lot about perception. And I guess at the current point, I'm not quite as concerned about perception, only because we have, number one, a very small sampling of the community involved in this process so far. Not a lot of people are engaged yet. And as we all know, we cannot make everybody happy, regardless of what we do. And when you look at the 4 targets, there are challenges and roadblocks to all of them. And we don't know the cost or the implementation details of any of them. And so to me, it becomes then about, well, none of these are really realistic yet right now because we don't know any details. And so what is the kind of message that we want to send to the community? And when I think about the kind of message that I want to send, I think you can send a strong message about where you want to go while at the same time setting a realistic expectation that it is aspirational and that things are going to continue to change. There are going to be hurdles and it may not be achievable in the time frame that we set out. But to Bronwyn's point, I think giving people a strong sense of where you want to head while still being realistic and honest with them about the process it is the best option when, frankly, you can't give an honest assessment of any of the options at this time.
I just wanted to quickly add that from the some of the student input we did, this was the most popular choice.
So I want to echo some of the things that the mayor said. All of us desire to see a reduced carbon footprint. So this is not a question of whether any of us are more or less committed to the task. We have a track record, I believe, and Mary, you can confirm this, that every recommendation you've given us, we have followed, and I believe every vote has been unanimous. I mean, I'm very proud of the city's track record on what we've done. Today, what we really have is a choice of whether we're going to offer a goal without offering any sense of the viability of the goal. And I want to suggest to you, I think this is hollow and disingenuous. This is not the consultant's recommendation. They made it very clear we can reach the same result using an evidence-based approach. This evidence-based approach gives us a chance to evaluate the viability of the suggestions that they are giving us. So we speak of being a data-driven city, and we come to one of the most important decisions the city has had. We're going to set that idea of being data-driven on the side. We're not going to follow that. This is an ambitious goal. In our last meeting, the mayor ran some numbers about the cost of housing modifications. And the cost of those housing modifications, correct me if I'm wrong, Mayor, just penciled out were in the vicinity of $400 million. So in our next month, we start budgeting. Are you prepared, if you're going to go forward with this, to start making hard decisions on our budget even now? So last Tuesday, we sat around this dais and we voted for increases to the arts and to human services. And there was not a single mention of climate in that meeting. Now, either this is ambitious, you shake your head, but David, someone's going to have to pick up the tab for this. And so if this is truly an ambitious goal that you're setting out, if you're really serious about this, then we're going to have to start figuring out how we're going to possibly pay for these things. It's going to require major cuts to programming and major increases in taxes. I just think that we could approach this by looking at the recommendations to consider from the consultant, evaluate the merits of those, and implement those as we have. And that's really in keeping with what we've been doing with Mary all along, as she's been recommending best practices. And as the mayor pointed out, it would give us an opportunity to work with our partner at Iowa State. I just think this is not good government for the people of our community that we serve. I'll be voting against it.
David, thank you. I don't think it's quite right to say that we are ignoring the data. We don't have the data. I think we all know that. We don't have the data. The reason that we are not allocating money for climate change and didn't discuss it that last week is because we have nothing on the table. We're at the beginning of a process. We're asking our climate team to do some research with a sort of abstract goal in mind. And I don't think you choose the star to orient yourself around with data. You choose the star on the basis of what you want to see. I have a couple other comments. I think for this aggressive goal, I like the idea that if 2028 rolls around, well, just imagine a bunch of stuff happens in 2022, 2023. Some things can be done, other things can't be done. And 2028 rolls around, there's a technological advance or someone notices something in the city infrastructure, or there's a new grant program. And someone looks at that, someone's the first to discover it. And they recall that, well, gee, the city set a very ambitious climate goal. They didn't quite make it. Now, is that person more likely to speak up saying, oh, yes, this is a way that we can still get towards that goal that's still hanging there that we couldn't get to before? I think they are. I think that this is a long-term motivating type goal, and I like it in that way. Also, I think I appreciate the concern about disappointment if and when we have to scale things back from the STAR. Might not make it all the way there. But I think the kind of disappointment that we'll be dealing with regarding this very amorphous target with carbon reduction, where the carbon that comes out of Ohio is the same, the carbon comes out of here. I think that sort of disappointment, if you don't hit the numbers right at first, is very different than learning that you actually don't get a bathroom in your building or an elevator or something like that. That those, these are global things that people want to do right by. And I just hope that when the community realizes what decisions have been adopted, what haven't been adopted by the city, that there's a measure of grace there and saying, well, we are doing the very best that we can here. Finally, I would like to just emphasize, I think it's clear in our conversation that if this motion passes, this is not a commitment by council to do anything in particular. This is direction for the team to pursue further recommendations. Everything that comes after that is going to be subject to further votes. And that's where you're going to say, we can afford it, we can't afford it. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Else?
I think this dialogue is helpful. I mean, we're working through some hard issues. It's a family conversation tonight. If a person knows that there's going to be a significant financial obligation around the corner, let's say you have car repairs to make, and you know this is going to get expensive. And a normal person would say, I better start making some financial decisions now because I know there's a major cost around the corner. And you talk about a signal. How we spend this money in this next budget cycle is going to send a signal. There are people in this audience that believe this is actually really serious, and we better get to it. And this isn't just a matter of window treatment and singing Kumbaya. We want you to do something. Well, that something comes next month. And this is, if you think this is not a commitment to do anything, David, we start this in January. And so either we're going to commit ourselves to start making cuts and programs to position ourselves for the kinds of financial obligations this involves, or we're going to go, the truly business as usual will be to go on and spend and handle our budget and CIP next month as if this doesn't exist. I think people who are watching this really want us to do something.
Well, I think let's just make it clear tonight, and that is the budget is pretty much already set and done, first of all. And secondly, budget from the standpoint, we're going to review it, but the point is staffs are working on it since August for the budget. And to David's point, we don't really have any projects. We don't have anything concrete. And I think we're on schedule to be September, for September or October for this climate action plan to be complete. It would seem that people need to, if they have expectations it's going to start next year, they have to reset their expectations because it's probably going to be July 1 of 2023 before any funding would start to be available, unless council would somehow either get a grant or somehow reapportion some modest amount of funds from their budget. But in terms of trying to move forward, and I think that is the other challenge, is to set 83% by 2030 gives us 6 fiscal years.
I do.
So anyway, so the point is that I think let's just make sure we're all on the same page. I don't see anything. I don't see how we're going to get anything wrapped into a budget this year. And we're also just throwing money at something that we have no idea because the consultants haven't had given us a chance to put something together.
Well, and I would add that in a way, we've been working it into budgets, right? So this goal is setting our target, setting our direction moving forward. But like you've said, Tim, too, we've made good decisions in regards to climate. So converting the power plant to natural gas from coal, for example, or devoting more money to bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. Like these are changes that we have made in the past in our budget that have already started to steer the ship. We're just asking for a pathway to steer it even more moving forward. So I think we have been doing those things to prepare, a bit in the budget in prior years too.
Okay. Gloria, anything you want to share?
Yeah, and this is not very organized thinking because I am sitting on the fence and the fence is very uncomfortable right now. Because I agree with many of the things that Tim has said and many of the arguments that John has made. I also agree that there is something to be said for setting a goal that is aspirational. Because if you set that goal, you are more likely to attempt to attain it. On the other hand, I do think it's somewhat hypocritical if you establish a goal that you know you cannot attain. And I'm not sure about this 83% by 2030. That seems like it's perhaps beyond attainable for us. And maybe it's more realistic to say 2035 so that there's more lead time. But I'm also conscious of the people who have said to me, council is always paying lip service to this stuff. They never put their money where their mouth is, and you're going to make a plan and you aren't going to do anything with it. And all I would say is that if we set this as our goal, our guiding star, our target, that I expect that council will be figuring out how to put our money where our mouth is and figure out a communication plan and an education plan that is going to help the rest of the community understand the nature of this target better than they currently do. Because if we communicate this ineffectively, I think there's going to be a lot of opposition. And because of this redistricting, there are going to be a bunch of people up for re-election in 2 years. So I hope that all of us sitting on this dais are willing to be committed to what we set forward on that path, and that we want to help others get on that path, understand that path, and that we are conscious of them as companions and partners who have their own goals that we need to understand too. Because putting food on your table is a noble goal, and retrofitting your home when it's up against putting food on your table may be a very difficult decision. And so I'm going to support this motion, but I do it only with the understanding that we have it as a target that can be modified if we see that things are not going to pan out the way they should. And that's not to say back off and don't do anything. It's let's be realistic when we actually do get the numbers. That's
Okay.
all I've got.
All right.
I'll make a couple of quick comments. I like a lot of what's been said already, so I'll be brief. But I'm obviously in support of this as well. I want to see the menu of items that's going to get us to potentially this target as quickly as possible. And we can only see that in moving forward with the most ambitious goal and seeing what the most ambitious actions we could potentially have to take as a community would be. Also, we don't know if we can attain any of these goals or not. That's why they're all goals. And so I don't know that we can say if any of them are realistic or not at this point because we haven't had the set of actions to take outlined for us yet. And one other thing I'll say is that to insinuate that having a climate action plan would make us cut programming, I think that none of the costs for this have been outlined yet, and we don't know where any of the funding sources for any of this will come from yet. And so I think that's a little bit jumping the gun because we don't know where the funds for this will come from. And I don't want to insinuate that we'll have to cut city programming in order to accomplish our climate action goals.
Okay.
Well, I mean, in fairness, it's a $400 million price tag just on the housing. I mean, we're not the federal government. We can't create money. And so if we're going to be serious about the kind of structural improvements in the community, either we're going to raise taxes or we're going to cut services or some kind of combination. Realistically.
Other funding.
All right. That's coming down the road. I think it's not it's speculation. Everyone understand the motion? Those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
Motion carried. All right. Anything else, Deb, that you need or consultant needs from us tonight? Otherwise, we're going to move on.
I think we're good. Thank you for your time and discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Thank you, SSG team.
Yes. Thank you. All right. Disposition of communications to council. We have none this evening, and so we'll move on to council comments. We'll start with Trevor.
Yes, so just a few things. I know for like Iowa State's climate goals, I'm not sure how Iowa State feels about that, but there's a big push from the student population to go more green and support this plan as well. And then I also wanted to say that in the output that we did, there's a lot of plans and goals for like the different specific steps. So I think students will definitely be involved with different ways we can help reduce emissions.
Thank you. Rowan?
Nothing for me. Thank you.
Amber?
Nothing for me.
I'll get you last. Rachel?
Nothing for me tonight, thanks.
Tim?
Well, I'll be ambitious to say I think I speak for the council that, David, this is your last meeting, isn't it? I think this is it.
Move to add another meeting.
So.
No second?
No second.
Failed to do a second.
No.
Actually, there may need to be one
So,
more one, but anyway.
I want to say that I think you have been a model city council member, and you leave big shoes for Anita to fill. We're very confident Anita will do an awesome job, but thank you for the thoroughness and the heart and the brain power that you brought to this work. You will be missed. We wish you the best in your next chapter.
Thank you very much.
Gloria?
What Tim said. But also, I will particularly miss your technological expertise and the calculations that you seem able to do with your computer, which are befuddling to a lowly English professor.
Can we still text you if we have questions?
Yeah, that's right. So you will be watching the council meetings, I assume, so that we can text you with questions. No one ever escapes city council. Other than that, I want to wish everyone a festive holiday season and a safe holiday season, a healthy holiday season. And I hope that 2022 will be a better year for all of us.
David?
We received an email. I sent it to council last week from Drew and Tammy McConnell, and they're asking about a rental situation I didn't fully understand, and I've forgotten what council's role in the process is, whether we have discretion to do what they want or anything. So I would simply move to ask staff to send council a memo explaining this situation to council. It could be very brief.
Second.
You can't turn down your last motion. You going to ask for anything bigger than this? This is your chance.
Those in
Let's
favor of
go
the
to this
motion?
one first. and then-
Everyone, those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? David?
I have no other comments tonight, except it's been my pleasure and privilege to serve with all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, I think for those who may be watching and, being in the audience, I just think tonight has been a great example of civil discourse. We all don't agree. But we are now unified and we're going to move forward with this. And I have no doubt that when Anita gets on board, she's going to do the same thing. But I just get tired of what goes on at the federal government and the state government. And I just want you to know we can do it right here in Ames. The school board can do it. Supervisors can do it. And certainly as a mayor, I'm committed to that. And we're going to continue to do that. And as Tim said, as family, you can talk about stuff and you got to voice your opinion, everyone came in with open minds. And I think, but the point is that I'm just proud to serve with this council. And it's kind of bittersweet tonight. David and I got elected at the same time and didn't know him.
I'll point out I was sworn in a day before you were. So.
He always rubs it in too. So. But we didn't know each other at all, and I would say that we become fast friends. We spent 4 years meeting with the city manager, and you're leaving a big hole. And I've really, really enjoyed serving with you. You've been an outstanding council member. You've asked phenomenal questions, and I think we both probably are detail oriented. So we probably drove staff nuts the first couple of years, but we got over that.
They got over it. Staff did.
They cover it well.
Don't ask staff. But it has been an extreme pleasure, serving with you. You'll be sorely missed. And I refer to David as my human Google. I can ask him anything about council, and I'm telling you, within 5 seconds, he'll say, yep, on April 13th, it was item number 33, and here's what was decided. And not that that's not the only value you bring, but you're a good thinker, and we wish it's bittersweet. It's bitter for us, but it's sweet for you that you're, moving on. And I'm just glad you're still going to own a house here because we know you're going to come back. And I look forward to the next chapter. And we just wish you all the success. And it's just hard to see it come to an end. So anyway,
thank you very much. Do you have anything else?
I just have one more item, and that is, council, we had to pull one item tonight. Vanessa is needing, you wanted a meeting. They're going to try and get this covenants cleaned up. And would you be available for a telephone call meeting sometime next week?
Sure.
And Diane will coordinate that. It'll probably be either Wednesday or Thursday, depending on the bit. Anyway, 5 minutes. With that, I have nothing else, and I think I know what David is going to be asking for. Go ahead.
So my final motion is that I would move to adjourn this meeting.
We are adjourned. And by the way, wish everyone happy holidays and a blessed new year. And we are going to be done, but for one very short meeting for the rest of the year. So we're adjourned.